So, proper intro. Welcome to today's event. I'm Gemma Monk-Hartley from Herefordshire Green Networks Building Sense Group, an initiative that was started in 2020 to bring together people, information and professional expertise to help with the challenge of making homes comfortable year-round in the face of both high heating bills and cutting carbon emissions. Since 2022, we've been partnering with local charity Machynlleth Energy Agency on Future Ready Homes, a programme that promotes and supports good practice retrofit of homes across the Machynlleth area. That is Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin and Herefordshire as well. It's doing this through a webinar series. This is just one of many. Retrofit advice, events like Green Open Homes that some of you may have attended in October, and also the Future Ready Homes Directory, which should be of interest to many of you on this call. That is a list, a database of local recommended retrofit professionals and installers. I will tell you a little bit more about that later on. But let's introduce you to our webinar and speakers, of which we have two today. So first up, we have sustainable building expert Nick Parsons. He's worked in energy efficient and sustainable building for over 35 years. He's one of the UK's leading experts in eco-refurbishment and a regular tutor in sustainable building and renewable energy at the world-renowned Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth, Wales. He's here to talk to us about working with contractors, how to find, brief and manage them to make sure that you get your retrofit project done well. And we'll also hear from Heather from Machynlleth Energy Agency. She not only works professionally in retrofit, but has just completed her own 9-month retrofit project of her own home. So she's going to be sharing her very recent, little bit raw learnings from working with contractors on her own project. Right, so I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to you, Nick.
And with luck, I'm going to be sharing my screen, which in a moment will turn from that one into a slideshow. So, all being well. No, it doesn't want resume slideshow. Aha, yes. Right, okay. Can you see that screen and can you see me?
Yes and yes.
Jolly good. Right, okay. Right, Gemma's already told you I'm Nick Parsons, based in Sheffield. Heather has just finished her 9-month retrofit contract. I'm currently in year 37 of my 5-year plan. So when it comes to timescales, don't try and follow me. So anyway, the one thing I am not going to be able to give you a specific answer is on who to get to do your retrofit work in your area. I'd struggle even to say who to get in Sheffield because there are not enough retrofit contractors to go around all the retrofits that need doing, but I'll try and give you some pointers that I have learned along the way. So basically, establishing your brief. You want to know what you want doing. So this is the preliminary stage where you decide what you want. And that may be results-based. I want a house which is well insulated and which has a good airtightness score and is heated in a way which I find sensible and will keep me comfortable and happy for the rest of my years here. Or it might be that you say, I want my home to include a series of things such as natural materials. I don't want to use petrochemical based materials. I want to use wood fiber, or I want to use hemp, or I want to use cork, whatever it might be. So decide what's really, really important for you before you start cracking on exactly how the job's going to be done. So if you prefer natural materials, go for natural materials. Set a baseline. So get a survey of your house done. So the full house retrofit report, which will basically give you an idea of where your house is at in terms of performance. You know, it's kind of average for the age of the house. It's rather better than average because you've already had some work done. Where it stands at the moment, and then make sure that whatever you do deals first with basic disrepair. We'll all have bits of our houses which are not in terribly good repair. The last thing you want to do with adding insulation and improving airtightness and so on is to kind of box in disrepair. If you box in disrepair, you're only going to have to tear apart your lovely new work to get at it later. So always get down to the basics of the house. If there's any damp issues or any moisture in timbers or whatever, deal with those before you start putting in the exciting energy efficient bits. So another consideration might be how you live in your house. Are you somebody that leaves the house at 7 o'clock in the morning and gets back at 7 o'clock at night? If you are, then having a house and a heating system which heats your house to 18 or 21 degrees throughout the day is probably not a very sensible solution, but it might also influence the way in which you insulate your house. If we assume that maybe you've got a solid walled house and you've got to put insulation on your walls, whether on the inside of your external walls, rather confusingly called internal wall insulation, has nothing to do with insulating the internal walls, but it's about insulating the inside of the external walls, or external insulation. External insulation means that all of your brickwork, and of course it's got plaster on it, but all of your brickwork is still exposed. So you are to some extent charging up a battery of heat in the house. Whereas if you have internal insulation, the thermal mass, the brickwork of the external walls is now hidden behind insulation. So your house will tend to warm up quickly and cool down quickly. Whereas with external insulation, it might take longer to warm up. So you might add that in your plans, or you might just say, well, for various reasons, I can't do external insulation, so it's got to be internal insulation, or vice versa. If you have clarity in your brief, then it's going to lead to a much easier to price job for a builder, and it's also going to be a more workable plan. So decide at the outset, what standards do you want to achieve? Do you want to get just bare building regs compliance? It's legal, that's fine. Or do you want to say, let's do better than that? Let's go for something like the AECB, the Association for Environment Conscious Building, carbon light standards, which can require heating fuel costs of, or heating fuel usage of 50 kilowatt hours per meter squared building fabric per annum, or and an airtightness of 2, or the slightly easier step-by-step one, which looks at an airtightness of 5, and sort of it changes as you go along in terms of what the fuel consumption is going to be. Or the sort of the blue ribbon, the passive house Enefit standard, which is 25 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum, which if you compare them with this sort of what our unimproved houses are consuming is extremely good. And some people have even done their retrofits to the new build passive house standard, and that's down to 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. But most mere mortals aren't going to actually get to that level. And how am I going to undertake my retrofit? Am I going to undertake it all at once? Am I going to move out? Do I have the luxury to move out and have it all done and then move back in when it's brand spanking new and lovely? Not many people have that option. I've done one job for a client who managed to do that. They moved out for 6 months, or so they thought, and they moved in about a year and a quarter later. So always expect the unexpected. Or else you might be doing it what some would call incrementally. And you hear the phrase incremental retrofit, and some people regard that as very damning, because in their eyes, it means that you're not going to do the job properly. You're going to leave gaps between the bit you did last year and the bit you did this year. I use the phrase incremental retrofit as well, but when I use it, I mean making sure that the edges of each section of work connect to the edges of the next section of work. So, for example, you've insulated underneath your ground floor. You then make sure that when you do the internal insulation of your external walls, that internal insulation comes down and connects to the insulation underneath the ground floor, that you make nice airtight connections as well. So incremental, doing it in bits over a number of years. As I say, 37 is rather extreme, but you get my drift. Doing it incrementally is perfectly reasonable, but you need to decide at the outset if that's going to be the case. Because if you're trying to live in a house while a builder is doing works around you, you've got to have very, very strict ground rules in your brief about where they can work, when they can work, dust suppression, all sorts of things. So, yeah, we move on to oops.
Yeah, no, yeah, we just need to go back a couple of slides. That's it.
Yeah, we move on to design. And this is particularly important in the light of the the newly revised building regulations, which they lift certain duty holders from the construction design and management regulations, which have existed for a number of years. And the roles in the building regulations will include a principal contractor and a principal designer. Now, what design work is needed for your retrofit? If you're simply internally insulating the external walls, you might argue that this is just an addition of layers. It is not necessarily something requiring design. But if you need to provide drawings to your builder, does it need an architect? Does it need an architectural technologist? Is it something which you can do on graph paper? I've done planning applications on graph paper. It's perfectly acceptable. I'm sure they probably prefer it to be sent electronically, but you don't. If you can do readable drawings, you don't have to be an architect. But the architect, of course, will have the background knowledge. So this is where you genning yourself up in advance, doing your homework is really, really important. If your contractor's designing things themselves, are they adequately insured? Because if there's a problem later down the line, then perhaps there will be a claim on some insurance. An architect will have professional indemnity insurance. Does the builder, if the builder's professing to do the design, does the builder have professional indemnity insurance? What happens, for example, if you have a builder and perhaps another contractor on site who isn't actually subcontracted by the builder? What happens if their two bits of work kind of bump into each other? One piece of work slows up the other piece of work. who's going to pay for that? So all of these things have to be thought through in advance, even if there's not a lot of drawings on paper or on screen. You're probably going to have some structural elements to the build, which might be, if you're building an extension, the foundations, obviously, the structure of it, but it might be in other parts. I've just had a structural engineer's assessment for my roof because I want to know that the fairly over-the-top insulation that I want to put in all of my attic bedrooms doesn't bring the roof down. And I'm happy to say it won't. But you know, there are issues where you will have to get other consultants in, and for that you may need some, even if they're only fairly basic, design drawings. Okay. So finding a contractor, right? Obviously, Future Ready Homes and local networks down your way.
Sorry,
yep.
Nick. Can you just check what's slide is on screen, because I can see ask, find a contractor ask. Is that the right one?
What's what?
Is it the right slide? Is it find a contractor ask? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, do your homework before you even get to looking for a contractor. So there's lots of links at the end of this slideshow presentation about websites and you know, old webinars and groups. Cambridgeshire particularly, they're pretty good on putting up videos done by people who've done their own retrofits and so on. Build Hub forum, very, very useful. Ask friends and neighbors. And if you are talking to a builder about it, if a builder, you say, oh, I quite like to use natural materials, and the builder says, oh, no, we always use plastic insulation boards and so on, don't be pushed into having what you don't want. You need to be very clear at the outset what you want. And if a builder, and I have come across it, if a builder tries to shut you down basically because you're not immediately acquiescing to what they want to do, then that either requires some detailed negotiations, or else that may be a builder to say, well, not this time, thank you. So, you know, it's not always straightforward. One of the best contractors I ever worked with, so I did small scale contracting. I did not do whole retrofits because my company consisted of me, but somebody for whom I'd done a survey, took them a long time to make up their mind. So some years later, they engaged a contractor to do the full house retrofit, and they engaged me as the insulation and airtightness expert. And this builder got in touch with me beforehand and said, I've never done this sort of highly insulated and airtightness retrofit that we're talking about. So can we have a meeting beforehand? And he was an electrician and general contractor. He knew his electrics, he knew his general contracting, but he didn't know very much about insulation and airtightness. And he was really, really good. I was on site for nearly 6 months. Almost every day he would say, right, Nick, we're going to be doing this, that, and the other today. Is that going to mess up any of the layers you've already done? Is it going to mess up any work that you're doing? And if you'd been looking for a specialist retrofit contractor, you'd have not found him in anybody's lists. And yet, unfortunately, he, like me, has stopped regular contracting. And yet, he is a person that did a really brilliant job. So don't ask your friends and neighbors for recommendations, but don't think that you have to ask for someone who has already done lots of internal insulation, lots of external insulation, lots of airtightness work. If you can find someone who is receptive and who, if necessary, will work with other people in order to ensure that those standards are achieved, then that's a really good person. Receptiveness is obviously a really key element. If, like I say, if you find your ideas being poo-pooed quite a bit, then you do perhaps want to question whether that is the right person for you. Okay, so you need to be, as I've said before, but I will keep repeating this because particularly the building regulations have always been important, but the rather more onerous obligations underneath the building regulations are really important to know, and they're at such an early stage that contractors and individuals are only just getting to fully understand them. I would not say I fully understood them at the moment. So a lot of asking and checking needs to go on. One of the questions which gets asked to me quite a lot is, what qualifications does my builder need to have? Well, in terms of actually being a builder, I have no qualifications at all. I did a degree in housing, I did building technology and all this sort of thing, but my knowledge of how to build was brought up by working for myself, working on my own house and working with other contractors, and gradually I built that up. The new rules under the building regulations talk about people having the knowledge, skills and competencies to do work. So this again is where recommendations are going to come in, because you don't necessarily, if somebody's got a badge, you don't necessarily know that they've got everything, that they're all up to date on the skills involved in getting that badge. Whereas if you've got plaudits saying, this person listened to everything I said, this person didn't just go on with their own agenda, they listened to me, they worked with me. Having said worked with me is quite important. If you're going to if you're going to do work on the building yourself, you do need to make sure that you are not getting in the way of, or worse, up the nose of your contractor. If you square all those things in advance, it's much more likely to go smoothly. Right. Seeking estimates or quotes. You start off, you want to do internal insulation, let's say. You've probably, if you haven't gone to a system provider, one of the people that actually provides the, let's say, wood fiber insulation and lime plaster system that you want, then you go to one of the merchants. They will probably have standard specifications for the particular elements of the work. You might get a bespoke specification drawn up, but even if you don't get a bespoke one, if you use the standard specification, so you can say to the builder, yeah, this is what we're going to want to do, this is how we're going to do it. It's not just a question of picking up a piece of insulation and slapping it on the wall. There are parge coats, air tightness layers to go on beforehand, then the insulation goes on, then we fix it properly, then we lime plaster it. If the better you can have your brief drawn up and pull up a specification from that, then the better the quote, the more accurate the quote is that the builder is going to be able to give you. Is it going to be a quote? Well, no, much more likely it's going to be an estimate, because you have to be very, very, very sure of yourself if you're going to give a quotation. That's effectively a fixed price, because in retrofit, you never know what you are going to find until you've ripped it apart. So if you base it just on having to take the skirting boards off and put some insulation on the wall, You might, when you take the skirting boards off, find some rotten joist ends and a little bit of rising damp and whatever. So I would always give estimates, but just because you give an estimate doesn't necessarily mean that the client has to feel, oh Lord, the price is going to go up. Because quite often I would actually charge clients less than I had estimated. If there was less, if I'd assumed, you know, a 10% allowance for unexpected things, and actually I only needed a 2% or a 5% allowance, I would effectively give them money back. I would charge them less at the end. Not everyone would do that, but you need to expect that a builder needs some leeway. And for that reason, I would also say have yourself a my screen keeps flicking around. I'm not entirely sure why. Yeah. I would also say have yourself a contingency sum. We've put 15% in on the screen, but it could be 10%, it could be 5%, you could be a pessimist, it could be 25%. But obviously having something to allow for the unexpected. Always know what you want to get out of the job, and then you can instruct people clearly. So if the main thing to you is that you want very high standards of airtightness and very high standards of insulation, and because it's a good thing, or because somebody in your household has respiratory problems or whatever, maybe you want mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. If all of that is set out at the outset, then that's going to help your builder in doing a quote for the costs of it, but it's also going to help them in setting out the schedule of works. Because if you've got all the ducting to go in for a complicated MVHR, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery system, you're not going to want to be boxing things up as you go along. The boxing up is going to be done more or less last. So you know, all of those things will make it easier for the builder. I would strongly suggest, if you're going to have more than one contractor working on site, that at very least they are introduced to each other and they get to know each other first, which is what we did on this one I was talking about. There you might find that a main contractor does not want you to bring anybody else onto the site. In effect, they have control of the site. Any other contractor coming on would be their subcontractor. And, you know, obviously there's a financial element in that as well. But if you want to use a specific person, you might, if necessary, ask the builder to use them as a nominated subcontractor, or you might, as this particular client I was talking about did, just have a loose arrangement where the main contractor is quite happy for a specialist contractor to come in as well, and they work together just on the basis of politeness and a good working relationship. So if you're going to have different contractors working in advance, I would arrange for them to meet. It might even be, this may seem excessive, but it might even be that if necessary, you as the client actually offer to pay them to come along to a meeting. Now that may not meet everybody's be to everybody's satisfaction, but if that might alleviate potential difficulties in future, then it may well be money well spent. You don't often tend to find out about money well spent until it's after the time when you should have spent it. Okay, so what's the contract going to be? It could be a shake of hands. I never did formal contracts with my clients, but there was always an exchange of emails or letters. And I would generally put down at least a broad indication of the work I was doing, and they would agree that, yes, that is what they were asking me to do. But obviously you might put the whole, you might have the whole specification as an addendum to the contract, so that it's quite clear what you're contracting for. Okay, who's going to manage it? Is the builder going to manage everything for themselves? Well, if they do, if
you just move the slides on, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Yeah, if the builder's going to manage everything for themselves, then how do you know where they are? If they talk to you on a regular basis, I would suggest weekly site meetings. Even if it's only for you to take a packet of chocolate biscuits for them at their tea break, that always goes down well, I can tell you. Then it gets you in the door, literally and metaphorically, and it gets you some sort of clarity on whether it is running to the expected timetable or not. I have had situations in one retrofit I was having done for an organization I worked for. Everything was absolutely fine. Everything was absolutely fine. Everything was absolutely fine right up to the last moment, except suddenly the timescale was going to more or less double. You know, had there been a better level of honesty and regular reporting, then that should never have got to that stage. So if the builder is managing it themselves, they need to be reporting very regularly to you, and basically reporting progress against the schedule of works. So, okay, we're halfway through the schedule of works. We know that you've done all the major ripping about, so everything else is fairly straightforward. So even if you've got kind of a little less than half of the time left, that should be okay. But if we're a quarter of the way through the schedule of works and you've only got a third of the time left, then we may have problems and serious talking needs to go on. If you're happy with the way the main builder does everything, they could be managing everything. They could be bringing in all the subcontractors, but whatever arrangement you're going to have, you need to agree it with the builder in advance. You could do the project management again, as long as the builder is aware from the beginning that you are doing the project management and is happy with that. And again, who's going to perform the key roles as set down in the building regulations and the Grenfell Tower Disaster Derived Building Safety Act. Again, quality control. If you have a really detailed specification and you have kind of breakpoints, so it's very clear that this particular thing ought to have been done by then, and that particular thing ought to have been done by then it gives you a much clearer indication of whether you are actually up to date. You might do an airtightness test at a relatively early stage, or not an early stage, sort of mid stage in the process. We did one before second fix, and foresee any conflicts you might have. Try to go through the program of works and so on, and think, is there any point where there might be issues? I can give an example. They seem minor, but sometimes they annoy me and sometimes they annoy clients. If you have sockets on internally insulated walls, so in my house, for example, I have 100 mil of rigid wood fiber insulation on the walls. The last thing I really want is for an electrician to come along and cut out 40 mil of my hard won insulation in order to put sockets in it. So My preference, and it's not everyone's cup of tea, I do accept, but my preference is for surface mounted boxes. And that's absolutely fine by me. My eyes are not offended by it. But if your eyes are going to be offended by it, then can you engineer it in such a way that all of the sockets are on internal walls? There's a job I did over 10 years ago, and I'm still upset about the fact that the builder's electrician found it very convenient to be able to cut 40 millimeters out of the wood fiber in order to put the sockets in. It might not have been possible to avoid it, but every socket they put on an external wall. If they'd have put more of them on internal walls, it probably still would have been workable, and yet we wouldn't have been compromising the insulation. If you've got situations where there's work being done by others, so for example, the same retrofit, the same one where they cut holes in the insulation for the sockets, roofers and electricians were in before we went in. The roofers re-roofed. Now, when we came to take out the ceilings on the sloping ceilings on the underside of the rafters, because we were insulating that, we found several rotten joists or woodwormy joists, rafters, sorry, roof timbers. And they had nailed their battens to that. They'd been on the roof, on those rotten or wormy rafters, and it would have been clear to them, but for reasons best known to them, they hadn't dealt with those. So then we had to cut them out from underneath, and we're cutting above our heads, trying not to rip the breathable membrane with the saw. That was just an example of something which is a bit silly and ought to have been dealt with properly. Another thing was that I had written to the client in advance saying, if you are going to have it rewired, then make sure that the wiring in the roof is either slack so that the insulation can be put underneath the wiring, so the wiring is not buried in insulation, or uprated, bigger than it would normally need to be, so that you can bury the wiring in insulation. Because probably most of you know that if you bury the wiring in insulation, make it nice and warm and snug, then it means the wiring is not able to cope with overheating as it would normally be. The flat profile of domestic wiring helps it to lose heat if you are running that circuit at somewhere near its design capacity. Okay, so let's just say, yeah, duty holders, again, Building Safety Act, you need to make sure that there is always somebody who is actually a duty holder and that it doesn't default to you. For domestic clients, you'll be pleased to know that generally it defaults to somebody further down the chain. It doesn't generally default to you, but just be aware. It's not exciting bedtime reading, but just be aware of what your obligations might be if, for example, your designer leaves the ship or your main contractor leaves the ship. And finally, I think I'm going to shut up in a moment, but back to the thing of genning yourself up, becoming an informed client. If you're an informed client, then you know much better. You're able to see if things are not going exactly according to plan. You are more able to ask informed questions, generally about the build, but also if things don't seem to be going according to plan. And you know, there's lots of slides. These last few slides, there's lots of sources of information for you. So I haven't found a contractor for anybody, but I hope I've given you some indication of how you can find contractors, use contractors, and particularly that a dedicated eco-refurbishment retrofit contractor is not necessarily essential. You need to find someone that's prepared to go along with your, even if they see them as slightly mad, ideas. As long as they are going along with them and not working against them, then arguably that is the right contractor. And I hope
Love.
that's of some help.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really appreciate that. There were some really interesting things in there, particularly about this idea of relationship. I think has come through really strong, and finding the right working partner and someone you can have sensible conversations with, agree that brief up front, be clear what you want, and then the day to day, how you're going to actually manage them and talk to them, and feel confident doing that because you know what you're talking about. So yeah, really important, really useful. And now, Heather, we're going to hand over to you to hear a bit about your experiences, which I think echo some of the things that Nick has been talking about anyway today. But yeah, as someone that has taken on a project yourself, to do the project management yourself, working with a contractor, what have you learned recently?
Yep, thank you. I will just try and share. There we go. Hopefully this works. Let's go. Is that working for everybody?
Yes, it is.
Good. Yeah, so I'm not well, yeah, I'm Heather. I work for March's Energy Agency. But yeah, this is an overview of my own house, so not work related, although I was hoping to bring knowledge and experience from work into it. I'm not sure where the 9 months came from. That would have been wonderful. We're at about 18 months and still got many more to do. So there we go. Yeah, so baseline, 1960s 3-bed detached, no insulation really, unfilled cavity walls, solid floors, less than 20 mil of loft. It was vermiculite loft insulation, a mixture of glazing, some singles. We've still got some secondary glazing and some old double glazing. And then we've got a series of sort of tagged on bits like a lean-to corridor. There was an extension done in the 70s or 80s, and the garage was just damp, which might not matter to most people, but we were trying to store outdoor gear in there. Very drafty. Doors were really drafty, front and rear, and these sort of A4 size air bricks in both parts of the inner outer brick. So really, really drafty. And a really, really old gas boiler, and the radiators that didn't really heat up because they were absolutely full of sort of rust oxidation and everything like that. So our aim was, you know, we needed to do work. I really wanted to do a deep retrofit and then get us off gas and go for low carbon heating. So I wanted to insulate everywhere. We did the lofts ourselves. We knew we'd do cavity wall insulation and maybe external as well. I wanted to dig down and do the floor. Thought we'd need triple glazing. And then with all these tagged on buildings, we thought we'd demolish and rebuild. That's with advice from the architect as well in terms of cost versus effort. It seemed better almost to sort of start again in those areas. And then the aim is heat pump and solar PV. Nick mentioned sustainability, wanted to use natural materials where we could and reuse what we could as well. Some of those things have happened, some of them haven't. So yeah, when we set about finding an architect, as Nick mentioned, you can do planning. We needed planning permission. You can do plans on, on the back of an envelope. I have done previously. We've done retrofit renovation before and drawn our own plans. This time I thought it's a bigger project. Let's get an architect. So we looked for local ones. Most of those sort of mentioning any specific retrofit were quite busy, but they recommended another contact, and he helped us with our plans and planning submission. And once we'd got the planning permission, then we felt able to go out to builders. I would have loved to have had this directory available at the time. We found, as Nick's been saying, that fully skilled retrofit qualified builders, people that understand, are really hard to find. We tried local firms, but we had 3 or 4, I think, come to visit, sort of local overall building firms. We found there was lots of they were interested in the finish in terms of a high spec kitchen and a high spec bathroom, but actually getting them to understand that detail of the retrofit, there wasn't any interest, and they were quoting ridiculous figures without that detail, and that just didn't make sense to us. So our builder we found through mybuilder.com, because we'd had a bricklayer in the past that we found there that was quite good. And basically he was one that communicated and we felt we could work with and would be flexible. We've still had our issues with him, but we felt that we could work because we were doing some work as well. But yeah, I would suggest, things like if you want specific retrofit elements like insulation or your heat pumps and things like that, you've got Trustmark, the MCS and Future Ready Homes Directory. and read the reviews, the good and the bad. And look at examples. If you can visit projects that whoever you're working with has done, go and do that. And we did. And again, that's why we thought we'd go with this builder. But our first mistake was probably going to a site that the builder showed us around. And the householder wasn't present because they'd actually moved out. It was one where they'd moved out completely. They weren't on site. So I would suggest, be a bit wary of being shown around by the builder. Go and talk to the householder. Ideally go whilst work's being undertaken and look at the conditions if the householder's there that they're in. And yeah, the brief, as Nick's been talking about, give each of your builders are going to quote a specific brief to avoid these sort of ballpark estimates that aren't looking at the detail. So yeah, some further thoughts on the brief is, does it represent what you have in your mind? Because I think at some point in ours, there's been a bit of a disconnect between what architects have written down, what's in my head, and what the builder thinks. And those don't always align. And get it proofread. We had, I think, the architect proofread ours and friends and family. And I'm going to confess here, I have a feeling somewhere along the line, just had a new baby, had an older child as well. We were living in essentially a cold, unheated house and lots going on. I'm not sure I sent the right version of my brief to the builder we eventually had. So there's the first confession, so don't do that. Make sure you do check. And that became apparent when I was trying to check glazing specs later on, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't believe that I couldn't find it in there. And the standard you're working to. So I think you've talked quite a bit about which standard building regs or beyond. And I'll just give an example, and it's not saying that you have to do this, but we demolished, as I said, these sort of tagged on buildings, and we rebuilt with timber frame with rock wool insulation. And the builder, it took a while to get out of him just what he was going to put in this frame. And I really wanted to know what the makeup was, because that's quite important to me. And he was going to put 140 mil of rock wool in. And that was going to give us a rough U value of 0.22. And yet the building regs for new elements in existing dwellings is 0.18, which is lower. And now I wanted to run a heat pump, so I actually wanted it even lower. So fortunately for us, this builder had just qualified as something called superfoil. And so we were able to rectify that by adding superfoil on the inside. But that was additional cost to us. And you mentioned airtightness. Although I saw him taping up joints and things like that, I'm not sure it's airtight. So, when it comes down to it, that level of detail, that attention to detail from him probably hasn't been followed. So again, once you specify this, and he says he's qualified and he's passed it all off with superfoil, they've ticked him off. But actually, I think that needs to be tested. I think that's where you do need those airtightness tests, if that's what you're aiming for. Again, another one on the building regulations versus different standards. Most of the time, building regs want you to have trickle vents in your windows and extract fans in bathrooms and kitchens. That's fairly standard. And if you're contacting any insulation contractors, they are going to be asking you to check it. They'll be checking first if you've got those, and they'll be putting them in. And that's perfectly fine for most buildings, because you do need some ventilation. But the time to question that is if you're going for something different. And we were going for this mechanical ventilation with heat recovery system. We did a DIY install and then had it commissioned professionally. But we opted for this partway through because I was still making up my mind partway through. So it wasn't in the initial brief. And it was only by luck that I prevented my builder then ordering windows with trickle vents in and trying to put extract vents in the bathroom and kitchen. So it was that I was lucky in that chance. I haven't had some sort of waylaid costs there. So the point is just make sure whoever you're working with knows what you're working to. If you change it part way, communicate it thoroughly, and also talk through the knock-on effects with them, because it might affect things that you hadn't really realised that they were going to do. Timescales and phasing. So yeah, are you going to live on site? We did, and we were always promised a Gantt chart for our project. The builder was managing the main build, we were doing other parts, and that never happened, partly because he was chasing his tail. He had other jobs, which is very, very, classic story. And so things happen whenever it's suited. So we had long periods with nothing, and then suddenly this is happening next week, which is not always appropriate if you're at work or you need to be away. So you do need to have some commitment to timings in your brief and eventual contract, albeit with some contingency for weather conditions, because you don't want them trying to pour foundations or lay rubber roofing in wet or freezing conditions. So you need to retain a degree of flexibility and common sense as well. And that's a bit where it's hard to have control over that side of it, because for us, it was a really, really poor year with a lot of pretty bad storms, pretty wet conditions. So it did delay things. Mess, living amongst large scale works is challenging, and there will be mess. So you really need to be prepared for that. And then if you do add additional elements, so you've got your brief, but you come across a problem, you need to do a different piece of work, make sure that's confirmed by email and written down and has got the same sort of, you know, timescales, contingency, etc. applied to it. So I'll just show you some pictures. This is us where we were living in. We'd knocked down quite a section, so we'd got these large sort of OSB sections. This is sort of through winter. The one with the bikes, that's the other side of the OSB. So we did try putting some rock wool up to try and retain the heat. We didn't have central heating at this point. We'd disconnected from the gas properly, permanently. The one down the bottom left, it's damp, caused because the central heating radiators had been cut. Thought they were sealed, but they'd managed to bend the pipe. So actually it was a really tiny leak, just going and going and going and going for ages. And when I came to pull off some wallpaper, I went, well, this was easy. Why is that happening? So it's just, it's having an eye on everything that's going on. The fourth picture across, that's classic what the electricians did. The electricians were probably our worst contractor, to be honest. It looked like a building site. We were essentially living in a building site. It was being treated as one. So I think you need to be clear in your brief about who is responsible for the mess and who is going to clean up each day. So the electricians were being contracted by the builder. So I think they thought it was his responsibility. And what would happen is, the builder wouldn't come back because he thought the electricians were on site. We'd be left with literally like that. We've got to walk through that and live through that every day. So the mess and the dust. And also establish if there are any no-go areas, because they sort of pop up in rooms where you're trying to live. And that's fine. They need to get on. But it's nice to have that communication so you do know. So yeah, it does get pretty cold and pretty damp. This is winter with those big holes in the house, no central heating, and no roof tiles at one point. One day I happened to check, it was 7 degrees C in the daytime in our main bedroom. So we all moved into one room, with the second one becoming our kitchen, living, dining space. But living all in one room and doing that means you get further issues such as condensation and mold from living in a small space. Yeah, so I mentioned if you add things in, get commitments in writing later. We found that we needed to re-roof. This was December, and there were leaks. We just sort of hoped it would survive. It didn't. We needed to add the roof in. There was some written agreement, but I think a lot of the timescales were done word of mouth. It was a case of, yeah, we'll get them off, we'll get them back on within a week. And we've seen that happen around us. We know it's possible, you can do. But what they did was remove the tiles prior to one of the named storms the week before Christmas. And we were left with plastic sheeting flapping around, no tiles on, no ventilation either. So our loft insulation, with us living below it, got absolutely soaked. And then this was 22nd of December. We had, I don't know if this will work. That working? Does this cannot play media? Oh, that's a real shame.
No. No.
No, it's not going to do it. Okay. Well, 22nd of December. This is the inside of our window. We've got water leaking in, and a bed was up there. It was going to leak onto the bed if I hadn't heard it happening instantly and happened to be there. The day after, we were going off to stay with family and friends. So if it happened a day after, we'd come back to absolute sopping mess. The fortunate thing was the builder was contactable and came out at 11 o'clock that night, after my husband had already had a go at trying to stop it. So again, I suppose another thing is out of hours contacts. If things do go wrong, have you got somebody you can get in touch with if you need that help at the point in time? Okay, I think you've mentioned the contracts and payment schedule. I would suggest a signed contract. I know there can be some, I know you can do it so very simply, but I think if you're doing a big project, all the things that potentially go wrong, I think you do need that, especially with payment schedules as well. You need an outline of a payment schedule so that you know what's needed when, but also retention. So we've still got a payment left to pay our builder, even though he's long gone, because I'm still trying to get things like the correct documentation out of him to make sure things can be signed off correctly. And there are still snags to be sorted, so it's very important to keep hold of that. And you might want to think about aftercare as well. It depends what you're doing, but heating is a particular one that you might want aftercare support. So for ours, we went for a heat pump, underfloor heating downstairs, radiators upstairs, and this unvented tank, which is lovely. That's probably the best thing about the whole thing. We've got nice hot showers, brilliant. But I hadn't quite got to grips with the heating timings, and for us it wasn't quite working. But we used a fairly established heating contractor to do this part of the install, and it was a quick phone call, and they've helped me reprogram it, and it's now working a lot better. So I think that's quite key as well, to know what you're signing up to, who you're signing up with. But if similarly with the builder, he said, for our rubber roof, the guarantee is with him for a certain number of years. That's all right, but what if he isn't around for much longer? What if his business folds? So it's good to understand how much support you will get if you need help later on. And yeah, coming back to project management, I think there's quite a few things in our projects that feel like really poor project management. I'd like to say our biggest sort of disclaimer is that we had a newborn baby and all the mess, and I don't feel like I project managed this very well at all. We also had the builder trying to project manage his element. The bits we did do, I'm happy with. Where we brought in people, I could control when they came in and how long they were there for. So I'm much happier project managing myself. But in my particular circumstance at that time, we probably shouldn't have been trying to do that. So in terms of whether you can do it or not, that's probably something to really think about. So if it's your only focus and you've got fairly good knowledge, you can communicate well, then yeah, probably is your best way to go. But if you're working full time, you've got other commitments, maybe you've got grandchildren, young children, holidays, even illness, you've got to bear in mind that sort of thing getting in the way. And if you're living in that site and the cold and the mess, that has quite an impact on how you feel about managing things as well. So retrofit's a lot more involved than sort of standard building. As Nick's talked about a lot, health and safety might be your responsibility as well then, if you're the project manager. One thing our builder was good at was the health and safety side. He had a pack, he had all the things signed off. Doesn't mean to say his subcontractors weren't running around without masks and trying to drive diggers over, scaffold planks, which they shouldn't have been doing, things like that. Despite all this in place, you look out the window and somebody's doing something else. And that's it. Certainly key for subcontractors. Often do what they want. So it's probably worth being clear who they're answering to, whether it's you, the builder. It's your home. You want to be able to go and tell them they should be somewhere or they shouldn't be somewhere. The electricians, I caught smoking in our house. We're living in that. I know it looks like a building site, but that's our house. Can you stop that, please? I had to go out and stop them doing that. And that's probably the most awkward I felt. Most of the time I had a good rapport with most people on site. That was the hardest bit, when I felt the most uncomfortable actually in that such situation. Yeah, part of project management is you've kind of got to supervise, really. You have got to be there pretty much every day that they're there. I'd say anytime that you're not, things happen that you're not expecting. So bear in mind that is a real commitment if you're going to project manage it. And take photos, take hundreds of photos of everything. because, you know, 5 years later, you want to put up a picture on a wall. Where can I put that? If you've got the pictures of it before everything went back up, you know where you can put your pictures without putting a hole in your, you know, your sort of airtight membrane. So maybe, you know, if you think it is sort of to involve maybe budget at the start for someone else to do that project management. And yeah, essentially be honest with yourself, I would say. So these are just some examples of the attention to detail things that we've had issues with. The one on the left, once we had a timber frame, like I say, rock wool and superfoil inside. Once it was all boarded up, I thought it was quite well taped, but I was playing with my son down by the floor. I could feel a draft, so we've had to go around and fill all these gaps. The top one is the floor insulation that was beautifully laid, wonderfully, all as one slab. And then they came to put scaffolding up to crane in and to crane in the sections of the timber frame. I never understood why it went that way round, or why it hadn't been numbered and taken off and out of the way. So they damaged it quite a bit. There's holes in it and things like that. And then just, this is only a minor one, but cavity wall insulation. The guy apologized when he turned up to do that. He said, oh, they've got the wrong mortar color. Now, we don't care because we're going to render anyway. That doesn't bother us. But if, you know, if it was a rendered exterior and they did that, you probably would. So just small details, really. Windows, yeah, they're a major hole in your building fabric. So check the specs that you're going to use. I think our builder lost out. Somebody folded partway. So then he was kind of trying to make up costs with less good quality. So the one on the left, this was a window which was bigger, well, due to be bigger, and then it became smaller. So the hole had been cut out. And I don't know if you can see at the bottom of the frames, there's 2 lines. So once it went in, suddenly it was boarded up, and we went, oh, well, has that been insulated to the same level as the rest? And my husband got up there, pried it apart, and went, no. So we've insulated it. But that would have been a massive hole that he'd have left. I doubt it will play. Is this one? Oh, it is going to play. There you go. There's our bifolds. I don't know if you can see that. I'll do it again. It's supposed to be airtight. It's not airtight, is it? You can see the drafts coming through. They're quite good. These are quite good things to show your airtightness, these decorating sheets. So yeah, we've got a really rubbish set of doors there. But we'll sort that out later. Let's try and get that. So the lessons learned for us: check and double check your brief, send the same version to everyone and know which version you're sending, and know what your builder's up to at every stage. And don't let them cover anything up or board anything until you know what's behind it. And I would say, unless you have lots of time and experience, budget for someone else to project manage it, probably somebody with some retrofit expertise. But it is worth it in the end. We do feel a lot warmer and more comfortable right now.
Lovely. Thank you, Heather. Much appreciated. Yeah, again, some really interesting points there. I think particularly this idea that it's your home, which brings another level of, you might be excellent at talking to other people and expressing yourself and managing people, but when it then becomes about your home, where potentially you're living as well, it can make it harder and more of a challenge to do that. So actually maybe either be aware of that, or maybe get a project manager involved that can help with that, because the last place you want to feel awkward is in your own home. But as you said as well, it is worth it, and that is the main thing. And if you can persevere, and I think have that active involvement in it, if you want it and if you feel capable, the knowledge you will have of your home and that experience and the control. I know I've spoken to a lot of people and they found it really empowering. And actually all of a sudden, from living in a home, but a bit of a shell, it's like it's then something that is truly theirs, and they've seen the ins and outs of it. So that's something to think about too. Get your questions in. We haven't got much time left, so if you've got any, please pop them in the chat. Just while you're doing that, both Heather and Nick mentioned, and I mentioned at the start, Future Ready Homes Directory. So we put this together because of this question: where do I find local trusted installers and professionals for my retrofit project? It comes up time and time again, and we can now see why. So if you go on there, you'll find installers, tradespeople and professionals. All of the people on there have been recommended, not by us, but by people like you guys who have had work done and had a positive experience to the point that they were prepared to put their names forwards. And we've got people, all professionals, tradespeople from Shropshire, including Telford and Wrekin, Herefordshire, Derbyshire, and Powys. It is growing, and we want it to continue to grow. It can only grow with more recommendations. So yes, it's getting the balance of enough on there, but not so many that it's not recommended people. So if you've got anyone you want to add, please let us know. Or if it's going to be a useful resource, please check that out for trying to find your contractors. And just very quickly, before we get on to the questions, coming up. So Nick mentioned, well, and Heather, do your homework, be prepared, learn as much as you can about retrofit, particularly if you want to be project managing, but even if just for writing a brief. So we've got past webinars, but we've also got ones coming up as well, including heat pumps. Are they any good? That's on the 27th of January. And in February, we're going to be doing one all about those big holes in your building that Heather mentioned, windows and doors. We've also got live event. If any of you are near US Herald, we're going to be there doing a live event where you can come and chat to us this Thursday, 28th of November. And in January, George, I think you were asking about assessing your own home. Well, you could come along to our Future Ready home at Telford to learn how to do a thermal assessment of your own home, which includes understanding exactly how EPCs work and how they are determined. So there's a few dates for your diary. Right, over to you, Tony. What questions have we got?
Okay, well, I think I'm going to fire straight in. Not surprisingly, we've had a number of, well, the key question: how do you tell the cowboys from the good guys? How do you assess they really know what they're doing? That sort of thing. Nick, can we have a quick resume of yes, the magic of how do you find a good builder?
Yeah, well, recommendation. That's one thing. People who have done similar stuff before, or like I said, people who have done possibly completely non-eco stuff for others, but have been good at it and have been prepared to listen. So, you know, it's largely word of mouth. People that are it might be that they come via trade bodies or whatever, but people who are prepared to listen, people who are prepared to cooperate and collaborate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Similar vein, how to be sure they will work to your budget and not what they think would be best for you. I suppose this comes back to the point you were making about your own knowledge and your brief, and getting your brief as tight as possible so that you know what you're getting and you pay for, you know, what you want rather than what they want to deliver.
To some extent, but there's also about having breakpoints in, so having a very clear program of work and breakpoints in there, so that to some extent you can say, right, by the time you get to point 14 of 28 points in my retrofit, we ought to have you ought to have done a third of the work but spent half of the money. If they've done a quarter of the work and spent 3/4 of the money, that's dramatic. But if you do that from an early stage, you ought to be able to have some sort of I know it's difficult, but you ought to be able to have some sort of control over the budget. And you'll also, by then, when you've got a few stages along, you'll also have a bit of knowledge about what your builder is like to communicate with, and you may have slightly modified your communication methods because of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Question, contingency, we kind of covered that. What is there a standard, Nick? I think we were feeling 15% is typical.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gemma said 15%. I think I said 10. But if you have been really tight in your brief, in your specification, then, and it's been priced according to that specification, then you might only need 10%, because the 10% is going to cover if it's a reasonably large sum, of course, 10% of not very much is not very much. But if it's a reasonably large sum, then 10% may cover the unexpected things that you didn't know about until the builder started ripping out. But I think 15% is quite prudent. I probably, unless you were really, really unsure of your ground, of your building, I'm not sure I would allow more than, I don't think I'd go to 25% or something.
Okay. Right, there have been a number of questions about is there a list or a register of builders? I very much hope we've answered that now. There is Future Ready Homes directory. Do Google it, do have a look. And I must emphasize what Jem was mentioning. March's Energy Agency is a charity, so we maintain our independence and our impartiality, and we don't recommend anybody, but we can pass on recommendations that are made by you. So you householders, you are the lifeblood of the directory, so please do keep recommendations coming, and the idea is it becomes a snowball effect and it gets bigger and bigger and better. And also you can leave reviews on builders, contractors, professionals who are on there. Talking of professionals, there are a number of questions about getting a whole house plan. There's an interesting point here made. Every surveyor who looks at my property seems to come up with a different plan or a different design of some kind, perhaps conflicts with other trades involved. So presumably we need to look at a whole house plan that is looking at the whole thing.
Yeah. Was that for me?
Sorry, sort of, yes.
Yeah, okay. If it's for me, I don't know if I'm allowed to advertise, but there is somebody who has done work with Future Ready Homes who is not only a retrofit surveyor, but also has done 2 very, very high standard retrofits himself. I would I'm not going to give his name unless you want to, but he sorry,
can go for it. He's on the
okay. Gervais Manguana of Waxwing Energy. I know that he lives down in your area. I'm not going to recommend anyone else in your area, only because I don't know them, not because if you have heard of them, I don't think they're any good. I just haven't met them yet. But yeah, Gervais not only is licensed to use the software and so on, but he's done it all. He's been heavily involved in it all as a contractor and as a client. So yeah, well worth getting somebody who has been on both sides of the river, as it were.
Yeah, fair point. Yes. So I must say, March's Energy Agency also offer advice. We can do whole house retrofit assessments. It depends where you live, but you may be lucky enough to get one for free, or indeed, if in Herefordshire, we're working with Gervais and we have some availability for certain types of property for not a huge amount of money. But I should mention in Derbyshire, there are whole house retrofit reports, surveys available, I believe at no cost, and the application is through, you need to look at what's called the Heat Hub, Home Energy Advice Team Hub.uk. You can apply through the website. That's Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire as well, I believe. So I'll get on to another question. If I can find another one. Well, how do we get more local professionals doing and encouraging retrofitting? Well, I'm going to throw that one at you, Nick. Have you got an answer for that?
keep plugging away. About two or 3 years ago, people would have said, who can I go to for decent quality retrofit work in your area, Nick? And if I wasn't blowing my trumpet too much, I'd say, well, me, and I'm not sure who else. I've now stopped, so that's 1 contractor less. But in the meantime, 3 other contractors, one of them a former client of mine, and well, 2 of them former clients of mine, in fact. 3 other contractors have come up into the mix, and okay, Sheffield's a big place, and we currently have 2 two-person partnerships and 1 one-man band. But equally, that's an awful lot more than we had before. So basically, just keep looking for good people. The person that does the one-man band that does quite a lot of work for my clients started off just as an electrician and small works contractor, but has gradually moved into the green field. So don't assume that general contractors can't do a really good job on green work as long as they are well briefed and instructed.
Okay, great, thank you.
And for the contractors, and for the contractors, if there's any contractors around, don't be afraid to ask for instruction and for who I can go to learn how to do this insulation which you're suggesting, and so on.
Well, that's another, yes, do get in touch with us through Future Ready Homes, because again, we have some training available for contractors through People Powered Retrofit, who you'll be aware of, Nick.
Yeah.
Right, a question about ventilation. Where does one learn more about ventilation and get good advice on ventilation? Very important issue when dealing with retrofit and air tightness, of course. I should flag up, we have we've done an air tightness and ventilation webinar that's recorded, so you can find that on the website. Nick, who do you go to for good advice about ventilation?
I sometimes spend I've just forgotten which document it is of the building regs. Is it part F? I sometimes go and read the building regulations, which can be pretty good for insomnia. You know, if you really want to sleep, then start reading the detail in the building regulations, and you'll have no problem in sleeping. I would have said my first point would have been to say go to People Powered Retrofit, because I know they have got webinars on mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, but equally you've got one as well, so that's fine. It does no harm to contact some of the manufacturers of fans and ask what they can give you. I mean, for example, it was lovely, Heather, to see your MVHR, but since I'm in year 37 of mine, I'm never going to have MVHR. So I use DMEV, decentralized mechanical extract ventilation, which does mean that I've got trickle vents in my windows. Oh, nasty leaky things, but they are there for a jolly good reason, because the 24-hour-a-day, very low-level extract from the wet rooms is pulling dry air in from the other side of the house, and then you allow undercuts under the doors so you could take it through. And some of the manufacturers of those fans have quite good sort of client resources on their websites.
Okay. Sorry, I've got a tricky one here about solar panels for you, Nick. Paul is buying a brand new house with a tiled roof, very concerned about fitting solar panels on the south-facing roof would damage the roof because of poor quality work. Concerned that getting issues resolved afterwards is difficult. Well, that's dead right. I would be concerned to get the roof fixed, irrespective of the solar panels, I must say, Paul. Solar panel suppliers demand full payment. Would putting panels in the front garden and some on the east and the west walls be a safe, viable solution? I would say in the garden, yes. On the walls, no, because the picture is going to be all wrong. Sorry, Nick, I'm jumping in.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I just read this question in the chat. I wasn't sure. He's very concerned that fitting solar panels on south-facing roof will damage roof because of poor quality work. I took that as being potential poor quality work from the solar contractor rather than there being a pre-existing problem. I don't know if there is, but I've worked with a number of solar contractors over the years who I've got to know about, have been recommended to me, whatever, and I've never known them damage the roofs, or if they do, never known them leave any damage on a roof. You can't help putting your knee on a dodgy slate or whatever, but I've never known them leave any damage, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. The thing about putting solar panels on the wall, well, if, for example, you have a wall which is nice and exposed and will get the low winter sun, if you can have a sort of combination of panels at an angle, and panels, you know, if you've got the low winter sun comes in over the hills and then will be more or less straight onto your gable wall or whatever, then you can do that. But that would, now I'm trying to remember, in your front garden, the permitted development regulations, so not having to apply for planning permission, means that if you have panels on a frame, you can't have more than 9 square meters of panels without planning permission. You could have a huge frame if you got planning permission. I think panels on walls are permitted development in some circumstances, but I am less confident, I'm less certain about that one. Obviously, most setups on roofs that you see are within permitted development. But I wouldn't be concerned per se that just because somebody's going to be climbing on their roof, on your roof, they're going to put holes in it. I've never had any major problems with solar panel installs. Some of the problems you occasionally get is if you put panels on an older roof and you need to do work later on, because then you've got to get a qualified person to take the panels off so that the roof can be patched or replaced.
Right. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up shortly, so do get in any last questions if there are any. Just a couple of questions about sort of slim insulation, well-performing insulation where you don't have a lot of thickness to play with. Inevitably, Jules is saying she wants room-in-roof insulation, but she wants something slim, but she wants preferably to use something natural, sustainable, if at all possible. Another similar question, how can I create a well-insulated warm roof given my rafters are only 75mm deep? I don't have a lot of head height, so I don't want to insulate beneath the rafters if at all possible. What's your go-to insulation where thickness is an issue?
Where thickness is an issue, I'm afraid I have used a lot of PIR, polyisocyanate, Kingspan, Celotex type material in the past. I don't particularly like it. It's not my favorite material to use. It's petrochemical. If you don't like using petrochemicals, don't use it. But if you have like a fixed maximum depth that you can go, right, I can go 6 inches, 150mm. Some of that will be between the rafters, the rest will be slung below it. You can either go for building regs compliance with PIR, or you can go for not building regs compliance with something fluffy and friendly like sheep's wool or flexible wood fiber or whatever. Don't worry if headroom's a problem, that is a problem. But just because you've only got 75mm rafters, don't think that you can't have a natural material which is a bit heavier than PIR. I've just had an assessment done for my roof, and I'm going to be putting quite a lot of extra weight by using nearly 250mm of flexible wood fiber and some rigid as well, so I can plaster on that. But I've got really chunky purlins, the beams which support the rafters, and I've got quite a steep roof pitch. So quite a lot of the weight of the rafters is not bearing down on the purlins, it's pushing down on the wall plates. And the structural engineer was quite happy about that extra load. Interestingly, if you do have a structural engineer do an assessment, he said to me, if I do the figures, I will prove that it isn't okay. But based on my experience and knowledge, I'm quite happy that that won't overload it. But it's a 130-year-old structure, so we've got some sort of interesting wording in there. But if he actually did the figures, it would say no, it's not enough to support the weight. But yeah, you may find that problem with older buildings.
Very quick question. Can you recommend anything to insulate roof slopes externally? I've heard of insulated roof felt. Is it any good? Seems too thin. Trying to avoid all the disruption internally?
Oh, well, I mean, if it's a detached house that you can do externally, you can have a warm roof. You can put, you know, 200 millimeters, 300 millimeters of rigid wood fiber on the roof before you then put your roof back on. And like external wall insulation, that's really the best way to do it. Leaving your building fabric inside a lovely warm eider down is brilliant, but that's usually expensive. A thin thing, most thin things have all the insulation value of a thin thing. So when somebody tells you that, you know, oh, we've got this insulation which is only 10 mil thick or whatever, it's wonderful. You have to ask questions there. I believe that some of the multi-foil companies might have something that can be used over as well as some under rafters, but I'm not confident about that to give a clear answer on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. That's wonderful, Nick. Thank you very much for getting back on all of those. I'm going to ask one more question of Heather, if I may, which was simply, was there any point where you thought about giving up on your builder and perhaps trying another one? Or would you thinking maybe we just open another can of worms instead of the can of worms we've already got?
Yep, there's times when I thought about selling the project as it was as well, when we were right in the middle of it. But yeah, it's so difficult to find somebody then if you can work with them. And I think because to a degree we're not incompetent when it comes to DIY, we felt we could at least follow and amend or correct if we needed to, which is what we're doing. But yeah, if you're completely and utterly reliant on them, then I would say get rid of them if they're not doing the work that you want.
Okay, thanks both. Very interesting, informative presentations, and I'll just leave it to Jem to wrap up.
Yeah, well, you'll be receiving an email from me in the next day or so with the recording. That will go out to everyone, and there'll be the extra slides that Nick mentioned as well that he didn't go through on the presentation, that are links and various things to help you do more homework. And you'll have some links to our previous webinars and obviously upcoming ones and stuff like that as well. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you for sticking with us. We still have like 40 people, which is amazing. We started out with 56 or 57. So yeah, you've stuck with us. So hopefully you found that useful. And hopefully you're inspired to get out there and now start writing your briefs, getting your whole house surveys if you haven't already, and getting on with your retrofits. I just actually wanted to note as well, both Nick and Heather kind of said it's really useful to go and see some people that have already had work done as well, both for ideas, but also to ask their experiences with the builders. You might get some good recommendations that way. Unfortunately, you've missed Green Open Homes now. It was last month, but it will be around again next year. And that's exactly what that's all about. It's basically people who have had their homes retrofit. And you can go and pick the brains of the homeowners to find out how they got on, who they used, would they recommend them, what did they learn the hard way, what can you learn from. Really, really useful. So anything else like that you can find out. There was something that went on at All Stretton last week, a big case study about a deep retrofit project to NFIT standard. Yeah, go along, just go and learn. Be really useful for you. So that is it. We're not going to see you now before Christmas, so seems a bit weird, but happy Christmas, everyone. And we'll catch you in January, hopefully, for the heat pump webinar. And maybe even you can come to Telford as well to learn about how to do your own retrofit assessments and understand EPCs. So thank you very much, and see you in the new year.